Rava, at samehoyana, vesawoyo diocha, kim sanya vidava. Uchihara uchi maya.
Before the rest of the family comes by to start our Malinak reunion, I just want to say a few things about my grandma Julia Stifel. She came to America in 1910 by herself, and she met John Stifel around 1913. 1914 they were married. Originally they lived on West Street. I believe it was West Street, where they had their first two children, George and John. Eventually, in 1920, they bought a house on Wilcox Street, the main family home for many, many years, for 50 years. And that's where the last four children were born: Steve, Mary, my father Joseph, and Felix. Also, I was told that not only they lived there and that was the family home, but the babies were delivered by a midwife who was so large that she had to be wheeled in by a wagon going from house to house. So that's how the babies were delivered, by midwife, not in a hospital, right in 44 Wilcox Street. And also from our discussions that we've had with the family, that Anna and Michael Malinak temporarily lived on 44 Wilcox Street as well. But then Anna definitely lived there, and Joseph lived with the family after the parents. Joseph lived with Julia after the parents passed. Another interesting story was that during World War II, Steve, John, and my father Joe were all serving in World War II at the time. And because of the Private Ryan rule, you couldn't have all sons of one family serving in the war at the same time. So my grandma Julia had to decide which son would not go into war. That is amazing to me. What a decision. It's almost like a Sophie's Choice decision to make. So when Grandma Julia passed in 1970, that was the last time I went to see the old house. And I think I was the last cousin to be born there, or born and raised on the third floor on Wilcox Street. Lived there till I was 6 and a half, almost 7. So quite many memories of that house, like many of our family houses. Cousins, aunts, uncles, parties, beautiful garden and fruit trees in back. They kept it so nicely. Many fond memories of Grandma Julia making apple pies, halupka, kolache nut roll. I'll never forget that, and I'll never forget my dear Grandma Julia, who I love very much. So, first of all, thank you, Barbara, and everyone for putting this together. Right now, we are with the Malinak Vera Family Cemetery Crawl. Our first stop is with Julia Malinak Stifel, my paternal grandmother, along with John Stifel, my paternal grandfather, and also Joseph Stifel, who is my father, buried here, a World War II veteran. And Julia Malinak was the 7th of 8, I believe, the second youngest of the Malinak family. This has been the family plot for many, many years. Happy all of you to come and make it. Does anyone have any story to share?
The only thing I can say is I did go to school with Felix. That was a long time ago. And who are you? Rose Mosey speaking.
Rose Mosey went to school with Felix Stifel, who was my father's younger brother. My father was the second youngest, and Felix was the youngest.
Yes, yes, he was.
And we all remember Aunt Julia, that's what we called her. And she lived close to All Saints Church, so we would often visit her. And we just loved her so much.
Thank you. We have the Peterson clan. We have Moses and Fred and Don. Is that Don? Don. And Roger, of course, and Bob. And Andrea and Barbara's sister. And we bought into Adrian. So this is our first stop. So I think we've captured. And I have one saying. I did bring some Slovakian spirits, but we'll save that after each cemetery. I have little paper cups.
You want to make it in the movie?
Yes.
Is that where the crawl comes in?
That was part of the crawl. Although we did it at every gravesite, we wouldn't make out of St. Mary's.
I have a Slovak story.
Yes, Fred. Go ahead.
My mother was born in Slovakia. It was Austria-Hungary at the time.
Yes.
And they were advised to get out because the war was coming. Sure enough, after that, the Archduke was assassinated. But they had made it out of the country. The oldest and the father of the family would go to America, get a job, get a place to stay, and then send for the youngest one. So my mother, Marion, was the youngest at the time. So she was born in Slovakia, but she didn't marry a Slovak. She married a Swede. At the time that they got married, rents were hard to find. So they lived with my Aunt Julia for 1 year. During that 1 year, my father learned to speak Slovak, and he was the best damn Slovak that you can imagine. He would never speak Swedish because he knew little, but he knew Slovak. And we were very proud of the fact. One little story to follow at the end. My father used to tease my mother and say, "You're a Hungarian." I'm not a Hungarian, but you were born in Austria-Hungary. My mother said, listen to this and learn. I'm not an Austrian. I'm not a Hungarian. But I am a Slovak. I came from Slovakia, and you better know it.
That's great, Fred. Thank you for sharing that. That was wonderful. Thank you.
I am Fred Peterson Jr.
Too many?
My father is Fred Peterson Sr., and he's buried right here. And my mother, Marion Agnes Malinak, is buried there. My oldest sister, Adele, was married to James Shepard, and they're both deceased. And my youngest sister is Marilyn. She is the most recent to have passed away. She died in 2020. Marilyn moved to Newington on property that my father bought as a building lot, but they raised tomatoes and things like that. And she married into Tom D. Wolf, and they are also buried here. That's about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred. Anyone else like to say anything? Introduce yourselves.
You do it. Oh, okay. Don Peterson, one of Dad's 4 boys and 1 girl. And you notice on the gravestone itself, of course, we've got Peterson name and Malinak down there and everything, but we also have a very custom design at the top, which is the Viking ship and a cross. And that was kind of a that had something to do with our family gatherings that we started to have a few years ago, and it became the symbol of the family. The Viking ship being the Peterson side, the cross being the combination of the Vikings and the Celts, or the Catholic or Christian traditions. So we combined the histories of both families into what became kind of a family symbol. And we had to get permission from the archdiocese, actually, because most Viking ships have a dragon head on it. And no dragon heads. The cross is wonderful, but no dragons on the Viking ship. One thing I almost forgot is my father and mother, we had 5 kids. So we made 5 shields on the ship, and with all the oars for each shield, and the joke came to be, yeah, all 5 kids got all oars in the water. And that's debatable, however.
This is the grave site of Agatha Malinak Farkash, who is the daughter of Anna and Michael Malinak. She is the oldest daughter, and she is also buried next to her daughter, Elizabeth Farkash, and Elizabeth's husband, John Kowalski. And I am John and Elizabeth, better known as Betty. I am their youngest daughter.
I'm Ginny, and I'm the oldest daughter.
And our brother and our other sister could not be here.
Yep. But they got cousins.
Agatha had several children. One was Catherine, and she married a Paradise, and this is Jim Paradise and Bob Paradise. Come on over, Bob.
And talent doesn't walk off the set until the director says so.
The story about Agatha is that she did come to America. She came a few years after her husband, her first husband, Stephen Janecko. And they came to New Britain first, and then, for reasons I'm not sure of yet, they went out to Whitney, Pennsylvania. And Stephen became a minor. They had 3 children there: Stephen Janecko, Joseph Janecko, who we knew as Buffy, and Anne Janecko, who was Anne Janecko Sackmar. Some of you remember that name. And then he died at age 39, and the story is that there was a boarder in the house, and he told the boarder to take care of his wife. And so several months later, my mother was born, then Catherine, and then they came back to New Britain.
They did get married. She married the boarder.
Yes, they got married. They got married. They had Elizabeth, they had Catherine, and then they moved back to New Britain and had George Forkash.
So was that extra rent with the border because of that?
I thought that was free rent, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That's what happens on the border.
That was a big take care of her. And so there is also a conflict on the name Forkash and Farkash, and people ask me that all the time. On Agatha's second husband, Joseph Farkash's birth certificate, it says Joseph Forkashevsky, Forkashski. So I think that the last son, George, finally made that transition. So he's called George Forkash. Although when Joseph died, 2 weeks before my mother's wedding. The story is that he was up in Boston in a hospital there with either black lung or some other kind of cancer. So he's not buried here. He's buried about 250 feet in Potter's Field. So at that time, keep in mind, all of these people were alive. So they found him a grave, that's where he's buried. So we'll see that in just a minute. But then when my father died in 1965, they bought these 3 plots so that she could be buried somewhere. So that is the story of the Agatha and her 2 husbands, Janeko and Forcash.
This is a nice gravestone for your parents.
Agatha lived with us when she got older and shared a bedroom with me and my sister. So that was quite an experience. We had 3 beds, just like a dormitory. She got the closet. I don't know where we kept our clothes, but it was close quarters, one bathroom for the whole house. And then Uncle George was downstairs in this den. So it was a real Slovak family.
So 2 bedrooms, 4 children, a grandmother and an uncle, all in one house on Park
But it
Drive.
was a fun house to visit.
Janičko vola, Janičko.
This is our grandfather, Joseph Forcash. None of us knew him because he passed prior to us.
He was the 2nd husband of Agatha Farkas.
He was the boarder.
He was the boarder that we talked about previously. And this was referred to as Potter's Field for people that didn't have a lot of money, and this is where he was buried.
Oi, Donai, Donai. Oi, Donai, Donai. Oi.
Anna is not buried next to her husband Michael. Michael died first in 1917. They must have been members of Sacred Heart Church. So they were only allowed to be buried in Sacred Heart Cemetery if you were a member of the church. So Michael died, they buried him on the other side of New Britain, and then I'm assuming that she then joined All Saints or some other church and was no longer a member of Sacred Heart, so they would not allow her to be buried there. But she died years later. So that's why she's here and her son.
The other interesting thing was nobody, when Barbara and I had been doing this research, together a couple of years ago, no one knew that Anna, we didn't know that Anna was, they even came over, our great-grandparents, and we didn't even know that they were, obviously, where they were buried until I somehow saw, on one of the ancestry sites, saw she was buried at St. Mary's. I called St. Mary's, I got a map, they told me where she was buried, and also with the son, who I didn't know, and the son, right in the recording.
Well, it's a very privileged spot to be right on the corner.
Yes.
You can't help but, even during a heavy rainstorm,
Picture.
you can still see.
Yeah.
Get in the picture. And then we're going to move on.
So, and also Joseph lived with Julia and her family for a short period of time, obviously way before I was born, but
That's my Uncle Joe.
your Uncle Joe, and they lived together, and I guess he never married? Did he, he never married.
No.
He had a disability, and actually he escaped from Slovakia, and he got over the border because of his disability. They were warned in the village that war was coming and they better get out. Joe was going to be drafted into the Austrian army, but he had a disability. That disability is what saved him when they got to the border, because he was not draftable material. So once he got across the border, they got on the ship and they got in touch with older relatives that had cut across before, and they established themselves here.
Do you know who those older relatives were?
Were they in Pennsylvania
No,
or were
no,
they in New
different
Britain?
names have always
names.
come up.
Yeah.
My wife's, my mother's cousins down in Stamford. At this time, I cannot recall
And
what the name was, but they were called cousins, relatives, and they all made it.
Cousins kind of covers it.
Now, where you were standing, the other graves are next door, and the Dohertys are relatives of my wife. On the island.
They're right next door.
Right next door.
Absolutely right next door.
Around and making love, raising cane and knocking over gravestones. And they knocked this one over. But because I frequently visited the graves, I noted not too soon after it was knocked over that it needed repair. So I made a box casting. This sits on concrete. You can see better. You can see better from the other side. And I placed it back here and braced it until the concrete would set. So I did apparently a good job because they never knocked it over again. This is my grandmother, my Uncle Joe, her son.
Kim Sonia Vidova Uchi hara uchi moje srce muči.
Quiet on the set. And action rose.
Okay, the name on the stone is Moisey, M-O-Y-S-E-Y. However, if you look around, you'll see that the other names say Mosey. And that was due to the fact that Joe Mosey was going to enter into the theater, and it was easier and sounded better to say Mosey than Moisey. So it's kind of between both names. Most of the time it's Mosey now. Okay?
What about acting in
About what? His acting?
California and acting and
Oh,
going into the
that
theater?
didn't go too far. He tried, but he didn't make it.
He never
No,
does.
no, what he did, what Joe did was to actually build the first bubble over the dinosaur prints in Rocky Hill.
Oh,
Yes. He engineered it and then it collapsed. It collapsed after
We don't want his name on
Add
that.
that part. Then he changes
So we
it.
changed it very good.
And they
Was he
built another
responsible
one.
for the Harper
No,
Civic
it
Center
lasted-
too?
it lasted
He changed his
a
name
A
to
little bit
Blumenthal.
too much of that plum wine when he was
time.
building the first one.
When they collapsed, the freaking Whalers were playing there.
But he was my grandfather who lived on Clark Street that I remember, and my grandma, and I remember actually when my father Emil Mosey was going to the hospital with my mother Rose Mosey to have my youngest brother, and she left me with grandma and grandpa, and I remember waving goodbye from the second floor porch to say, "Ma, you can't leave us here." She went and had my brother. So.
Did they have any plum wine?
Did they have plum wine?
That's good.
But Auntie Sandy used to live on the first floor. Sandy Belesa used to live on the first floor. And I don't know, is there her grandpa was on the first floor? Grandpa was on the second floor. And we used to always be there, over there. 181 Clark Street, New Britain.
Third floor. They put her
So
on.
we
Do we
spent
know?
a
Do
lot
we
of
know how
time
Michael
there.
and Elizabeth met?
It was like a one-bedroom up
How
there.
did Michael? How do we know? Do we know how Michael and Elizabeth met? No.
No. Supplies.
We
No.
don't know. We do not know when Elizabeth came to America. She's the other missing link.
Talk a
We
little.
know
Talk a
when
little louder,
Michael
Barb.
came.
Talk a little louder.
We know when Michael Mosey came. We don't know when Elizabeth came. So that's a little piece of information we have to dig up.
The only one we know, like Julia met John at a fire. We talked about that on our Zoom call. In New Britain, there was a big fire in town, And they met at that fire, like townspeople were gathered and watching the fire department do their thing. And
Which one of them set the fire?
and sparks flew.
I was just going to say, where did the sparks come from?
Very good.
Pustim porehlas, hej, počuješ mamili, ale manje spoznaš.
Michael Malinak is our great-grandfather, and he came to the United States in 1901. There's evidence that he was here and traveled to New Britain and also went to Pennsylvania, but then came back to New Britain, and this is where he lived, and this is where he died. So I believe he came when he was in his late 50s. I believe he was only in the United States for about a dozen years before he died. And then his wife came in 1905 with young Marion, and his other children followed. Joseph came with him in 1901. His wife and youngest daughter came in 1905, and the others came in 1906, 1907, 1910. So that is when they all migrated, from 1901 to 1910. There he is.
And why couldn't be buried with the, why was he buried in Sacred Heart?
He was buried in Sacred Heart because that was the church that they belonged to. They belonged to Sacred Heart Church. And from what I read, if you were, you could only be buried here in this Polish cemetery if you belonged to Sacred Heart Church. So once he died and Anna joined another church, she could not be buried here with him. So he is here by himself.
Plum wine, from the motherland.
Plum wine?
Plum wine, but it's very strong. So
what's your
okay.
wine?
Taste. Little tastes.
Plum wine.
It's
plum good.
On the,
Don't drink until we toast.
No, I'm smelling it.
It's also good if you run out of gas.
Is it kind of
wanna get
expensive
plum
gas?
I can smell it from here. I don't drink, thank you.
Don't even lick it.
No, I'm good.
Ready?
Nishio Rodina Malinako.
Salute.
Oh, my word.
Plum wine
Throw
from
that
Slovakia.
That's not wine.
This will go hair in your chest, Rose. Take it off or burn it off.
Povedal mi Slavíček, že už jde Janíček po luke po zelenej, a jak svoje milé premilenej. A keď ma ty ráda máš, predaj všetko, čo ty máš. Vinice, vinohrady, a tak ma ty vymeň z vojny. Zaleč sokobieli vtak, ku mojmu milejmu. Zaleč sokobieli vtak, ku mojmu milejmu. Pozdravuj ho na 100-krát, pozdravuj aby přišel večer k nám, že ho pekně prosím, aby přišel večer k nám, že ho pekně prosím, že ho velmi ráda mám, že ho velmi ráda mám, že ho v srdci nosím, že ho v srdci nosím. Zaleč sokověli vták ku mojmu milému, zaleč